Okay, folks. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hamre. I'm very pleased to have you all come today. It's kind of a soggy, wet day. You could just well be inside. You know, we're going to have a wonderful afternoon together. Look forward to this very important conference. Before we begin, let me just say we always have a little safety announcement for everybody. So if we do have an incident where I have to ask you to get up and leave, please follow me. The exits are right behind me. You know, there are 3 doors. The stairs that take us down to the street are right closest to this door right here. But just follow me. We're going to go downstairs. We'll meet across at National Geographic. I'll get some ice cream or something, and we'll celebrate. We all survived, okay? So but follow me if we need to do something. I need to just give a bit of background for this project so that you understand what you're going to hear today. This is a remarkably important thing. It isn't because we were involved, but because of the context of where we were. I remember it was last May, a year ago May, that Chairwoman Fu Ying, who was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee for the People's Congress, came to me and said, we think that the time is right for a serious study done by Chinese think tank scholars and by American think tank scholars to look at the future of this relationship, the China-U.S. relationship. Very important, several important things to note about this. Number one, it was by its design meant to be very broadly scaled. It wasn't just one think tank working with another think tank. This was meant to be a very broadly scaled inquiry, and which is part of the reason why you see the strangest publication you'll ever see in a think tank coming out. It doesn't say CSIS or any institution, because it really represents the collective work of about 7 or 8 institutions that came together on this project as we donated scholars and worked on it together. Second, this was a project that we began last summer before the presidential election. We didn't have any idea who was going to be elected. We were looking to say, what is the future going to be of this relationship, independent of the particular outcome of an election? I think that's even more important today than at the time when we launched it, because we're at a stage where we need to be thinking about the fundamentals of this relationship. And I think that's what comes through. There are two sets of parallel papers. This is the publication our Chinese friends produced for their papers, and this is the publication of the American papers. They're parallel. They were not meant to be, it wasn't meant to be a study in unison singing. It was meant to be a case of singing in harmony. And can we together look at these questions and with not sugarcoating anything, being very objective about it, can we look to see what should guide this relationship going forward? And I think both sets of papers, and I think you'll hear this today, both sets of papers really come to the same end point. This is an enormously important relationship. How America and China will work together over the next 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, will fundamentally shape the well-being of the human community. We have to figure out how we're going to work together. It could go badly if we don't work together, because there are so many forces in both of our respective countries that are pulling us in the wrong direction. There are so many forces that could pull us into a path where we're going to have a difficult, conflicted, contentious relationship. We have to be active in managing this relationship with a spirit of candor. We're not going to hide the differences. We have serious differences. We're not going to shy away from being honest and vocal with each other about those differences, but we also have to be constructive to try to at least find solutions for them. Not only for the well-being of our country and China, but for the well-being of the rest of humanity. This is an important relationship. We're going to explore this today. And so I'm very delighted that all of you would take your afternoon to join us. We're going to start right in, and let me ask Dr. Michael Green, who is going to be the moderator for this first session, to take it from here. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Mike Green. I'm the Senior Vice President for Asia here and Professor at Georgetown. We had 5 issue papers with authors for each paper or papers on each subject from the US and China. We've split the panels up so that this panel will address the papers on US and Chinese strategy and interests in the Asia-Pacific region, and also US-China military-to-military issues. And the next panel will cover economics, global issues, and politics. And Scott Kennedy will chair that session. We had a number of participants who helped to write the papers or who joined us in study groups to review the papers. So this is a representative group. It's clearly not everyone who was involved, but some of the key authors for each of the papers we're going to address in the panels. Bonnie Glaser, my colleague at CSIS, senior advisor and director of our China Power Project, will talk about the Asia-Pacific papers. We're going to ask the panelists not to summarize the papers, but to identify between the American and Chinese papers the issues of convergence, divergence, and some recommendations. My friend Zhu Fong from Nanjing University will present on the Asia-Pacific strategy issue after Bonnie. Then we'll shift to the military relationship. David Finkelstein of the Center for Naval Analyses and Zhang Tuosheng from the Chinese Foundation for International Security Studies will address the areas of convergence, divergence, and implications of what we identified and analyzed in military spheres. As Dr. Hamre said, we endeavored to make these papers that would be based on the U.S. national interest and U.S. strategy on our side, and on the Chinese national interest and Chinese strategy on the Chinese side. We did these in consultation with each other, meaning that, for example, on the Asia-Pacific paper, Bonnie and I, with Zhu Fong and his colleagues, talked about how we might structure the papers and what key themes we would try to address. But we were very clear about several things. We had no veto over the other side's paper. It had to be an honest and forthright explanation of interest and strategy from that country's perspective. We informed and talked to our governments, but the US government and the Chinese government did not review or approve these papers. They're independent. We are all independent scholars, and so what we presented is not US or Chinese government policy, but we think it represents a pretty good consensus point about how these issues are viewed in each country. Of course, there are multiple views about military affairs, global issues, North Korea, in both China and the United States. But we had, for each of these papers, 3 authors on the American side, 3 authors on the Chinese side, and a group of somewhere between 6 and 15 other experts who weighed in. And on the Asia-Pacific paper, for example, and I think this was true on our side for the military paper, there was an awful lot of consensus from experts hailing from think tanks across the ideological and functional spectrum. So it's quite interesting. Between the US and Chinese papers, there were some common themes. One was that we should strive to avoid becoming adversaries. That was consistent for both sides. There was a theme in all the papers that we should seek out and try to build patterns of cooperation between the US and China where we can, on every area, military, Asia-Pacific issues, and so forth. And many of the papers concluded that the United States and China need a substantive, honest, and far-reaching strategic dialogue where each side doesn't cover up its fundamental interests or concerns and presents those and goes from there to see what can be done. There are obvious strategic and structural differences that come out in these papers. These are not differences that can be solved with a different 6-character label or 120-character tweet or whatever you choose. They're fundamental, they're structural, they're historic. We spent a lot of time on the history of these issues for our countries. For example, There are, between the two papers on the Asia-Pacific, some different assumptions about the future orientation of the Korean Peninsula. It's not just disagreement over tactics on North Korea. There are some fundamental structural issues about how the U.S. and China each respectively view the Korean Peninsula and where it's going in the longer term. There are some fundamental differences in terms of the South China Sea or the first island chain that encompasses Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines and the East and South China Seas, about what it means to have influence, control, denial. This is not a small issue. There were differences about how strong American alliances should be, very basic differences. Not so much about the validity of alliances, but how strong should U.S. alliances be in Asia. There were differences about what China should be doing to assert its sovereignty. Not challenges over sovereignty per se, but what China should be able to do to assert its sovereignty, and what is destabilizing and what is not. There were big differences on both sides. I think Dave will say more about what constitutes a reasonable and acceptable level of defense capabilities. I don't think either side drew that yardstick exactly the same vis-a-vis the other side. And there were differences about how we should think about the future structure or order of East Asia. There was more enthusiasm on the Chinese side about some kind of bipolar U.S.-China arrangement or condominium to manage the future of Asia. There was much less enthusiasm on the U.S. side, but even within the two sides there was some debate and disagreement. I'm going to let my colleagues go into more detail on these areas and just conclude for now by saying I think when you read the papers, you'll find that these are papers that sort of stand the test of time, that are not based on today's or tomorrow's news about the G20 or the North Korea problem, although we can talk about that. And then in some ways they may be a useful model for what a strategic dialogue would look like and how you would try to address each side's fundamental interests and try to find ways to minimize confrontation, maximize cooperation, but be realistic about some pretty fundamental differences that we've unearthed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bonnie and then Zhufang to address first the Asia-Pacific paper. Let me quickly add, we printed out as many papers as we thought we would have audience, this being 4th of July week, and we were short, we were about 50% short. So this is online as well. And so you can get it online and check it out in Chinese and in English, I think. So with that, Bonnie, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And this is a very interesting project. I would urge you all to read these papers very carefully, and it's a privilege to be part of this. We have a very short period of time, each speaker, so I'm just going to really hit on some highlights, and then if there's time for Q&A, we can go into greater detail. First, some of the convergences and divergences. Both of these papers on Asia-Pacific security say that there is a need for a rules-based order. So that's a good start. We should have rules. But of course, there are differences over not only what those rules should be, but whether or not the international community is likely to allow, even welcome, China's participation in the process of shaping the rules. So the U.S. paper is quite clear on that score. It says that America is not calling on China to simply sign on to the rules that have been written in the past, but understands that the international community will draw these rules up together and that China would join in the process. The Chinese paper is very skeptical of the U.S. willingness to do that. It says, whose rules are these? How can these rules be defined in light of the changing situation, et cetera? So a lot of suspicion, and I think you find throughout the Chinese paper and the Asia-Pacific security that there is a lot of skepticism about U.S. willingness to include China. Even though I would underscore that I think the current administration, prior administrations have welcomed China to be a responsible stakeholder in this rules-based order, and that goes back at least as far, of course, as the George W. Bush administration, who coined that phrase. Secondly is regional security architecture and alliances. And the Chinese paper very much contends that the U.S. alliance system is increasingly targeting China, and it calls for the United States to give up that attempt to build this sort of anti-China coalition. And it states that China favors an open and inclusive security system rather than alliance-based system, but says China can tolerate the alliances as long as they're not targeted at China. So a little bit of ambiguity there as to whether ultimately alliances can be part of the system. But it does, the bottom line is that the US-led alliance system can coexist with increasingly influential China in the region if the U.S. gives up that effort. Now, for the U.S., this paper doesn't portray in any way the alliances as aimed at China, and it talks about the allies as the basis of our regional position. It lists several threats that our alliances are trying to deal with, such as, of course, North Korea's emerging missile and nuclear capabilities, talks about terrorism, maritime conflicts. So a very different discussion of alliances. When I was at the rollout in May in China, of the Chinese version of this, Madam Fu Ying talked a bit about China's concern about alliances in the regional security architecture. So I think that this really is a difference that the U.S. and the Chinese have about whether or not the alliances should be part of this rules-based order going forward. Third, both identify areas of concern, pretty much the same as you would expect. You've got North Korea, Taiwan, maritime issues. On North Korea, I think the U.S. paper claims that China doesn't recognize the new level of threat posed by the Kim Jong-un regime. And I think as we sit here today, events that have transpired in the last couple of days and months really provide evidence of that. The United States is, I think, incredibly concerned about the launch of an ICBM by North Korea, very upset about how U.S. citizens are being treated, and of course the most recent being the very tragic death of Otto Warmbier. So I think that the Chinese paper in some ways recognizes the danger, but insists that the problems just can't be addressed through sanctions alone and that diplomacy is necessary. But I do sense a real gap between the two countries in terms of their assessment of the urgency. The U.S. paper has some interesting policy recommendations in this regard, calling for not only more dialogue, but very specifically on things like non-combatant evacuation operations, interdiction of North Korea's weapons proliferation, closing loopholes in UNSC sanctions. The Chinese paper honestly doesn't have any of these very specific areas of potential cooperation, and I would underscore the need for discussions on crisis response in the event of instability in North Korea, and that's something the U.S. has tried to do with China for several administrations as well. There are solutions that are put forward by both sides, and I want to highlight again some of the convergences and divergences and comment on them. Both insist on peaceful resolution of disputes, avoiding military conflict. Though the U.S. paper focuses much more than the Chinese paper on the need to manage differences. Of course, we would note that Xi Jinping does talk quite a bit about managing our differences, so I think that's a common position. Both papers call for more candid strategic dialogue on major issues in the Asia-Pacific region. And the Chinese paper proposes an institutionalized and regular communication mechanism between China and the U.S.-led alliance system. This is something interesting, and we should recall that there has been consideration in the past, for example, of a trilateral U.S.-Japan-China dialogue, which was supposed to take place in June of 2009 and for various reasons did not. So should we consider, once again, ways that we can offer China reassurances about our alliances engaged in maybe trilateral dialogues? On a couple of final comments on the divergences between the two sides in terms of their recommendations. So as Mike mentioned, the Chinese authors do not rule out a G2. They say either a G2 or through other forms of security cooperation, China and the U.S. need to establish a joint vision for the region that is inclusive and based on mutual consensus. I think that would be a very, very difficult thing to do. I don't know if we can establish a joint vision, but certainly the U.S. paper, and I think reflecting mainstream views in the U.S., rule out such a G2 arrangement. The U.S. paper says that Washington is not interested in any sort of condominium that implies an exclusive great power relationship. And finally, the Chinese paper continues to call for adhering to the components of the new type of great power relationship, 新型大国关系, even though it doesn't use that phrase. But it says we should adhere to the principles of no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. And I think accurately reflecting the late Obama administration as well as where the Trump administration has come to after its first several months in power, that Americans in general don't like a bumper sticker phrase, and there continues to be enormous discomfort with some of the implications of this new model of great power relations, including the components. So again, the U.S. shares the goal of avoiding conflict, but it worries that emphasis on core interests may be an attempt to create spheres of influence, and that could be potentially destabilizing to the region. So on that area, I think there is some disagreement. And I look forward to Jufeng's comments.
Thank you. Jufeng?
Okay, thanks, Mike, for your leadership in organizing such a large events. I think we're also looking for long, but more importantly, so what impressed me and encouraged me is in the past 1.5 years, so we're working together, we thinking together. So of course, then current, we say reports, no matter how we just author it differently, but it's a reflection, some sort of a shared spirituality, shared vision on how the regional security could evolve in a way, we say, and compatible with the both sides. A couple of things I'd like to pick up and responding to Bonnie's excellent presentation. First of all, of course, divergence and convergence is some sort of a reality. So we need getting through some sort of a very accurate reality checking. But from or some sort of consent, we consider some sort of such accuracy of the reality checking should be get back to the history. So then we use the history tracing as some sort of very interesting starting point. Then we will find U.S. has been a very positive security anchor in the region. No matter how China matters in terms of our power status, I think for long run, China benefit a lot from the Americans' very steady and very constructive, regional partners. That kind of a reality is a bigger one bearing on the Chinese side. Second, I think, of course, if we look at the current some sort of a potential, we say, risk, probably will causing some sort of a collision between the two powers, then what's the leading element to create or drive that the divergence? Then we have to say it's not a status-driven, it's an issue-driven. So yes, there's a lot of speculations across Asia. For example, for the moment, the leading challenge is that China is coming after the hegemonic transition. But I have to say it's a fallacy. Yes, some Chinese nationalistic paranoid way may see it that way. So then you read some sort of recently published book. It's called Everything Under the Heavens. Then China may think some sort of a Chinese leadership very simply from a historical perspective of a sinocentric tributary system. But I think for most of our Chinese well-educated scholars, that kind of sinocentric system is totally gone. I don't think it will be staged out once again in coming days. So then we will see, yes, there is some sort of a robust power shift compared to the 20 years ago, 30 years ago. China-US power, we say some sort of such a disparity is truly very significantly diminished. But US have a very solid hold of a power disparity ahead of China. we don't think in the coming days such a power disparity will truly is getting undercut very, very tremendously. So then from the Chinese perspective, yes, Asia-Pacific area is biggest tasting ground for U.S.-China relations because a lot of interest now is in some sort of a collision, then we are competing on some sort of a path-taking solutions and methodologies. But the problem is, if we get back to some sort of centerpiece to be behind the both strategy, then we prefer to see, and it's also very adequate and it's also very reasonable. It's issue-driven. It's not a status-driven. The second is, then we will see some sort of Chinese assertiveness in the Asian Pacific. Of course, this place is a very important, the tasting ground, as I mentioned, to have a serious examination of the China's foreign policy redirection or ground strategic shuffling in coming days. But from our perspective, we consider Chinese methodology in the region is largely some sort of China's domestic transition based, is not the power gripping or power competing based. For example, North Korea issues. I consider the China's policy of DPRK has been very consistently unsmart. We suffer a lot from some sort of a negative spillover of the China's indecisive policy of DPRK. But why? It's very hard for China just to come after a very tangible change of North Korea policy. Most important roots or reason should be get deeper into the China's domestic factor. So before China can become some sort of a very successfully transformed power, we consider China remain vulnerable at large. So then in the region, we don't consider it will be some sort of, competing place to afford the China some sort of very inherent assertiveness. Then another point is, we consider no matter how we diverged, but our strategy and policy should be oriented, future-oriented. It's not just a history, we're oriented. Then there's a lot of speculation, for example, Thucydides' trap will overshadow the power relations between Washington and Beijing, and someone believe the Chinese and the Americans will be just rivaling and also getting into some sort of inevitable conflict. So, the Harvard professor Allison also just published his very sensationalist, the book. It's called Destined for War. But we don't see that way. We consider U.S. and China, we can jointly creating some sort of new modeling of our power relations. Conclusively, I have to say Chinese reports on the Asian Pacific area is also, of course, a very, very interesting challenge for us. So on the one hand, we also have to balance of points from some sort of China's traditional policy narrative. But on the other hand, we also like to bring about some sort of new inspiring points. It's not an easy job. So I have to say, most important formidable task on the Chinese side is not how we can just envision some sort of power stories between the U.S. China in the region, is how China can overcome some sort of our domestic inherent shortcomings become before the China could be a real popular power in the region. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. You contrasted our papers well in 8 minutes, and you fitted in 3 book reviews. So well done. I appreciate it. Thank you. Over to the military side of this panel, to David.
Okay, thanks. And thanks again to John Hamre for providing the leadership of the American Steering Group. I think without him as the glue, the American side would have been in a high state of entropy. So thanks for that, and thanks to Michael and Scott Kennedy. 3 of us comprise the military and defense writing team. Myself, Randy Shriver from Army Armitage Associates, and Phil Saunders from National Defense University. All three engaged in this in our personal and private capacities, and I'd be remiss if I didn't state that nothing in the paper or anything I state today reflects the views of CNA or any of its sponsors. And I think if Randy and Phil were here, up here on the dais with me, I'm sure they would provide the same caveats. So, as you heard, we're not supposed to summarize our papers. Ours is 25, 26 pages long. You can take a look at it. But I feel a need to at least provide you a sense of our overall assessment. And the reason I feel a need to do that, our assessment of the state and trend in U.S.-China military and defense relations, is because this is the major area where the U.S. and Chinese sides did have some convergence, recognizing some of the positives and recognizing some of the negatives. So let me give you a gisting of the U.S. assessment of the state of being. And it goes like this. At the moment, the relations between the U.S. and Chinese militaries are more stable than they have been in decades. The two militaries are engaged in a wide range and unprecedented number of interactions, from the strategic level down to the tactical level, that they've never done since relations were established in 1980. Both militaries are working together at risk reduction to ensure that highly contentious issues do not result in miscalculation. And the U.S. team assesses that neither military seeks a conflict nor sees it in their nation's interests to resolve differences between us by military means. However, all is not necessarily well in the military and defense dimensions of the U.S.-China relationship. The U.S. writing team adjudged that the competitive aspects of the military and defense relationship are growing and intensifying. Both sides have deepening concerns about the other's defense and military policies, as well as uncertainty over each other's future intentions. The competitive dimensions are most intense in the Asia-Pacific region, where traditional U.S. predominance in the maritime and aerospace military domains and China's expanding offshore reach and increasing military capabilities are intersecting. Strategically, the U.S. is determined to sustain its long-standing military predominance in the region through forward military presence and its system of alliances and partnerships, whereas for its part, we assess that China, from a U.S. perspective, is purposely developing military capabilities to challenge U.S. military advantages, as well as military, political, and economic means to weaken the U.S. alliance structure in some instances. Operationally, this competition is being characterized by the development of weapons and technologies aimed at accruing operational advantage, by doctrinal adjustments to maximize their effectiveness, and by shifting force postures and deployments. Beyond Asia, in other parts of the world, there are and will be more opportunities for U.S.-China military cooperation, and we look forward to that. And we also recognize, as China's military's footprint around the world steadily increases, the potential for new misunderstandings beyond the Asia-Pacific region cannot be discounted. So because of this intensifying competition, carefully managing the military dimensions of the U.S.-China relationship has to be a top priority for American and Chinese civilian and military officials to reduce the chances of confrontation and ensure that military tensions do not overtake other areas in the relationship that are cooperative in nature. So those are the U.S. side's bottom lines. And I think if you read the two papers, you won't see a lot of daylight between them. Now, on convergence and divergence, both sides agree that this relationship between the militaries is more stable, but both also assess that this is taking place against a disturbing context that I laid out, in which the U.S. and Chinese militaries are increasingly wary and suspicious of each other's intentions, and that both militaries are, in fact, hedging against each other operationally. And on this account, the Chinese paper, I think, was a bit starker maybe than the U.S. paper, where the U.S. paper, my paper, talks about intensifying competition. The Chinese paper talked about concerns that, quote, the potential for clashes over security interests between the two countries has grown rapidly. So both writing teams did laud the efforts of the Pentagon and the PLA to introduce confidence-building measures into the relationship. And both sides agreed that a military conflict would derail both countries' larger domestic and strategic objectives. And they both acknowledged that each side is presenting significant security challenges to the other, and that both are exacerbating each other's security situation in the Asia-Pacific region. On divergence, the two papers, of course, converge in identifying the common set of problems, but they do diverge in many ways in explaining motivations, causality, and impact. I think a significant example, I think either Bonnie or Mike raised it already, was differences in respective views on the motivations behind the U.S. alliance system, or on the Chinese's part, motivations behind Chinese military modernization. Very different views between the two sides on what those are all about. Overall, though, I think that the two papers, if you read them, will provide readers a very sound appreciation for the strategic perception gap that exists between the two countries on a wide range of military, defense, and security issues. And readers should also come away with an appreciation that the military tensions are a reflection of competing national interests and fundamental policy decisions of civilian leaders in Beijing and Washington, and not just the decisions of military officials. It's much broader than just military issues. On future cooperation, if you take a look at the paper, we found many ways where we can be cooperating in non-traditional security. Some folks have mentioned that already. But I think the most important thing to zero in on is what both teams did zero in on, and that is cooperation on the very difficult issue of North Korea. And I think if you read the papers, both the U.S. and Chinese teams cited the need to engage in crisis management activities as regards the peninsula. And I think that's an important potential opening that we need to pursue, either at a Track 1 or Track 2 level. Final points, going forward, developments since January 2017. I think the events of the past week have underscored that the U.S.-China relationship remains a tangled and messy web of issues which impel the two countries, on one hand, to cooperate, but another set of issues that produce contention and competition and great tension between the two. And the military dimensions of the relationship are no different, though some of us are concerned that the competitive dimensions are in the ascendancy. But it is clear, I think, that leaders in both capitals today recognize this competitive problem and are attempting to manage the two sides of this relationship, to include on the defense and military side. One of the recommendations in our paper was to conduct an assessment of the efficacy of the military and security dialogues that had proliferated over the past few years to determine whether or not they were serving a good purpose. Now, clearly, leaders in Washington and Beijing have already voted on that account, having dismantled the SNED and creating the new comprehensive dialogue, and with its diplomatic and security dialogue, which had its first meeting, of course, just 2 weeks ago. Now, after the defense and security dialogue, Defense Secretary Mattis commented that the idea of the new venue is to, quote, elevate and focus the discussions, and I think that on defense and military relations, elevating the discussion and focusing the discussion is a pretty good idea. So there's a new start to these discussions. Whether there'll be new solutions remains an open question, and I'll stop at that point.
Thank you. Tosan?
I'm very glad to have a chance to participate in this great event. I will be focused on 2 points. First, about my viewpoints about the 2 reports. I think there are a lot of consensus and similar observations in the 2 reports. For example, both sides believe the male-to-male relations is a very complicated relations with both cooperation and competition. But this is very, very different from that between the former Soviet Union and the United States. Another example is both sides believe, although in recent years, the frictions and the suspicions has been increasing, especially in the West Pacific region. However, neither military seeks a conflict and tries to resolve differences by force. For this, both sides have achieved a lot on establishment of CBM and crisis management regime. Another example is both reports believe in recent years the military relationship is a highlight of the whole bilateral relationship and more stable than it has been in decades. This is not only reflected in the enhancement of the differences and crisis management, but also in the keeping and upgrading talks, exchanges, and developing more cooperation on non-traditional security and global governance. Besides, both sides' policy proposal has a lot of convergence. I shall not mention them one by one. However, both sides' reports also have a lot of differences. Here I just point out two more striking ones. First, Americans report believe the Asia-Pacific rebalance strategy and the operationalization of the rebalance by DoD is inevitable and very positive. It's in the interest of the United States, its allies, and the defense partners. However, China's report believe the rebalance, especially the military element in the rebalance policy, mainly aimed at China, and regard China as one of the major security challenges. In result, it has intensified military and security friction between China and the U.S. and increased tension in the region. Secondly, Chinese believe the maritime friction is increasing. One of the reasons for this is Americans' invitation, and the U.S. has taken side. However, American reports believe that is Chinese military capabilities expansion, and especially the maritime capabilities expansion, and China's assertive policy and activities, which are the root of the maritime tension. Besides, both reports pointed out a lot of differences, which refer to Taiwan, Korean Peninsula, regional architecture, security architecture, cyber, outer space, nuclear relationship. Now, we can ask a question, why we have this kind of male-to-male relations? Both reports' answer is the economic independence, the common global challenges we are facing, the common desire of no conflict and no confrontation. All this decided that both sides must cooperate with each other, including the passive security cooperation. On the other side, because we have different political systems, we have different values, and we have some different national interests, it has decided that we must have some differences. And especially in the new background of the change of a balance of power. China is a rising power, US is an existing power. So because of this, all this has led to the aggravation of military frictions and competition. Then, how can both militaries close their differences or manage them while also exploiting the potential areas for cooperation? Both reports has raised a lot of proposals. In summary, mainly 3 points. The first is we must always keep and expand dialogues and exchange, the military dialogues and exchanges. Especially, we should have new talks in the new strategic domains, just like the nuclear talk, cyber talk, and outer space talk. In this way, then we can increase the understanding of both countries' strategic intentions, decrease misunderstanding. Secondly, we must put a reduction of risks operational safety, crisis management at the center of our effort to stabilize military relationship and avoid military conflict. The third is that we must strengthen the non-traditional security cooperation. In this area, we sit in the same boat. Now, I will talk, my second point is about bilateral military relations in the first half of this year. And it's, the prospect. I think in the first half of this year, generally speaking, the relationship is stable. We keep talks and expand new talks. And especially early this year, when the two presidents meet each other, they reach consensus to strengthen the cooperation on denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. And also because of the relaxation in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So all this is beneficial for the stability of the bilateral military relations. However, in recent months, there are some negative elements. U.S. has took twice the so-called freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea and declared military arms sale to Taiwan again. So this has bring about negative impact on the relationship. Now the two leaders are participating in the G20 conference. Both leaders will meet each other. And very soon we'll have first talks between the two joint staffs. And President Trump will visit China in the second half of the year, this year. I hope these efforts could stabilize the male-to-male relationship and stabilize the overall relationship of our two countries. It will be beneficial for the regional peace and stability. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuoshang. Let me ask one or two questions of the panel, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. We covered a lot of issues in these papers, from India, Pakistan to Hawaii, and of course all the military and defense issues in different domains. Let me focus first on one area which is in the news very much right now, and that's North Korea. It seems to me of all the issues we looked at in the paper, including cyber, including AIIB, of all the issues we've looked at, the Korean Peninsula is the one where the United States and China could, because of our interactions on the North Korea problem, in a few years become much more trusting of each other across every issue, or truly sensing they were adversaries as we were when the Korean Peninsula was at war. And it seems to me that's the one issue that you could have the biggest impact on the overall sense of whether we're adversaries or we can work together on hard problems that affect our security. And we're not in a good place right now on North Korea. And Zhu-Feng, you mentioned that part of the reason is within Beijing it's very hard politically. The president announced his disappointment that the Chinese side couldn't do anything. And yet probably Xi Jinping is doing more than was done before, but it's clearly not enough to convince the US side. Let me start with Bonnie and ask you all, are there concrete things that we can do? Right now, Russia, China are blocking the US, British, French draft in the Security Council on the North Korean launch. The US has imposed, or has announced it will impose secondary sanctions against Dandong Bank and other banks because the Chinese side hasn't policed and cracked down on those sanctions violators themselves. Are we stuck on these this is a very specific set of issues right now, but it has very broad geopolitical implications on what our relationship looks like. Can we expect more out of North Korea cooperation than we're getting? I'll start with you, Bonnie.
Well, I think that when Xi Jinping and President Trump met at Mar-a-Lago and agreed in principle to cooperate, after that meeting, the Chinese really tried to identify what it was that the U.S. really wanted. First, the Chinese interpretation was compliance with existing UN sanctions. China's always opposed any kind of unilateral or secondary sanctions. And China has banned, of course, coal imports from North Korea after reaching the cap under the UN Security Council resolution that was passed at the end of last year. The Chinese also told the U.S. that it was tightening up in terms of border inspections. But I think that there's been maybe a failure on the Chinese side to identify what it was that would really satisfy the United States, not meet all of our expectations, because that wasn't in the cards anyway. And it really goes to this issue of banks operate in Northeast China that are facilitating North Korea's access to the international financial system and enabling North Korea to engage in these illicit activities. And so there has been efforts by the Trump administration to provide evidence on banks and front companies that are enabling North Korea. And the reaction, as I understand it, from China was not sufficient. And that's why we saw this 311 action last week. But there can be a way forward. I mean, China can take action against these banks. If not, I suspect what we've seen is the tip of the iceberg. We've only seen one bank cited. That's Dandong, and there are more. But it would be better if China does this rather than the United States does it. In particular, because some of these small banks and front companies do business in currency other than US dollars, and they really are beyond the reach of sanctions like those that we imposed under 311. So I think there is a potential way forward. Maybe when President Trump called Xi Jinping on Sunday, maybe he articulated some of the things that we're looking for. If Xi Jinping can deliver some of those things in this meeting in Hamburg, maybe there is a positive pathway. I think neither government really wants the relationship to sour over this issue. The best outcome for the United States is more cooperation from China on North Korea, and I think the best outcome for Xi Jinping as he heads towards the annual Zhongnanhai meetings, the 19th Party Congress, and eventually, of course, Trump's visit to China later this year. He wants the U.S.-China relationship to be heading in a positive trajectory also. So I think that there is a way forward. We'll see whether we get there.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike, I think you raised a very, very important question. I think, of course, China and the U.S. could do a lot more to cooperate over the DPRK issue. But the key variable is how to measure, how to define the China's cooperation. For example, I know how frustrated maybe community in the U.S. are, towards the China's policy of the DPRK. Then President Trump also complained there's some sort of a significant China's some sort of a help to reining in the DPRK. But for Beijing, we will not overwhelmingly cut off the trade relations, because trade relations with DPRK in some sort of normal term is China's leverage, is China's some sort of a political preemption against the DPRK's meltdown, because such an unexpected DPRK's meltdown will be victimize Chinese too much. But on the other hand, we will see such a normal trade relations is the Chinese way to domestically keep some sort of geo-ideological, we say, some sort of such a calculation. So it's not easy for China to punch the table and cut off all the trade relations with DPRK overnight. But the problem is, I think DPRK issue now has become some sort of leading points where how strategically readjust the relations between Washington and Beijing could be significantly and also exactly crystallized. Just imagine, back to the Korean War, we're really enemies. So North Korea means some sort of place the Chinese Americans will similarly shed a lot of blood on. But now, there will be a second Korean War. You ask question for the Chinese, overwhelming majority of Chinese say, no, it'll be crazy if the U.S. just say, kick Kim Jong-un's ass militarily, China will reach out and help him. No, such a thing is totally gone. It's a big strategic change. Second is, now we are also getting close to some sort of, we say, strategic judgment of what the DPRK is. It's a threat not to the US, it's a threat to China either. So we need to figure out some sort of joint contingency plan to really get the DPRK well settled. But the problem is, where is the starting point? How we can just, move very firmly but very notably going beyond some sort of a historical heritage, remain just on the way for our better cooperation. For example, for Chinese, what's the DPRK? DPRK is history, DPRK is ideology, DPRK is China's security state, we say, way. DPRK is also some sort of, we say, untangled, some sort of a personal, emotional, connections. It's not easy, but trend is very positive. So I really hope two things could be serving as a very decisive, I think, the criteria. One is, if there is one more nuclear test, I really, really hope the Chinese government could give them a bigger punch. Even just decides the suspension of all your provision. Second, if the Kim Jong-un really want to, we say, turn it back to the international appeal to de-escalate the tension and stopping there some sort of endless missile test, we also need to get them pinched, get them hurt, economically and commercially. So I really put a lot of hope on upcoming second round Trump and Xi Jinping summit meeting. If some sort of a new, we say, summit momentum could build up, then we will see both sides could just head into a more specified and measurable cooperation.
Thank you. I personally think that China's approach to North Korea is not what it was a year ago, and it's certainly not what it was 20 years ago. But the changes are incremental compared to the growth of the threat itself. Certainly, as Bonnie said, that's the view in Washington. And for our Chinese friends, I can tell you, if the Chinese security services turned over several containers of centrifuges or precursors for reprocessing, or shut down in very specific ways bank accounts in about a dozen banks, having worked this issue in the White House for 5 years, boy, would that have a huge impact on how the administration, any administration, thought about how trustworthy China is on this problem. I'm going to come back to David and Toshwang also, but I want to give the audience a chance for one or two questions now. Raise your hand. We have microphones. Very briefly, who you are and your question. So I have the gentleman in the blue shirt right here.
All right. Thank you. I'm Gao Zhiqin from the University of Washington, Chinese student. I have a question about North Korea's situation. We have all been talking for a long time about what we should do, which is putting plans to solve this crisis. But I want to just put forth for one scenario for the panelists to respond.
Can it be a very, very brief scenario?
Yeah, it's very, very brief. Yeah. So how about having China to have the kind of dominant control over North Korea nuclear scenario, and having the United States internationally recognize North Korea so that we can solve the denuclearization problem? Thank you.
We'll take a couple. One more. Yes, ma'am. Up in the front.
Hi, my name is Jamie.
A little bit louder.
Hi,
Thanks.
my name is Jamie, and a couple days ago, North Korea just launched a missile and landed in Japan's sea. And I was wondering, how far will it let it go for security-wise in building that momentum for figuring out something out with what actually should be done in letting North Korea keep testing the missile and landing in the sea?
And you're asking about what is China's line of tolerance, or the U.S.? Or both, okay, internationally. Maybe one more? Yes, sir. we're making our interns run.
Hello, my name is Cameron. I'm an international relations student at Miami University. My question is regarding the idea that Etzioni Amatai came up with mutually assured restraint, and whether or not that's a viable option given the two papers' viewpoints, especially from diplomatic as well as military channels. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's start with Tuoshang, and then David, and we'll work this way.
I will talk something about how to deal with the North Korea nuclear issue. So I think China's position is very clear that it's in the interest of China, not just try to satisfy the U.S.'s demand, because we think if North Korea became a de facto nuclear state, it will be also a disaster for China. For example, North Korea is the #1 country withdraw from the NPT under so huge pressure, but finally became a nuclear state. So it will establish a very bad example to the other countries. Then the NPT will collapse. So many people will follow suit. Then so many nuclear states will surrounding China. It's not in the interest of China. And the other thing is that the military conflicts, the risk of this is very high. Now, though any country really try to solve the issues by military means, but if there's accidental conflict, if there's a misjudgment, there could be a military conflict, even a war, and a nuclear war, just at the border of China. So it's terrible. And thirdly, I think, even without war, but because of the very tension situation, U.S. will increase the military presence, develop a threat, strengthen the military alliances. So it's also not in the interest of China. So I think China are determined to realize the denuclearization. But we must have cooperation with the United States. Without the coordination and the cooperation, we can't achieve anything. But on the other side, U.S. and North Korea will make some compromise between yourselves. Otherwise, we can also achieve anything. So in the future, I think China's policy is very clear. First, the denuclearization and the freeze the nuclear program should be the first step. And in the long run, denuclearization is the goal. And secondly, we should prepare for the worst case scenario. If North Korea refused to go back to the negotiation table, if they made the 6 nuclear tests and ICBM, so we should put more pressure on them. Yeah. But now, there is still a chance, a little chance for resume talks. And we should have a try. Anyway, we should also not just put pressure on them, we should also give some parrot. Parrot, yeah, to them. Yeah. Anyway, we can just depend on the pressure. But if they refuse to go back to the negotiating table, we must prepare for the worst case scenario. So at that time, especially after 6 nuclear tests, maybe China and the US and South Korea should have a talk about how to deal with the contingency. It's in the interest of all the countries. It's also a kind of a signal to the North Korea. You can't go further. So anyway, we should strive for the best. We should prepare for the worst. This is the only way to deal with this crisis.
Tuoshang, can I follow up and pick up the question that was asked over here about how much the international community should tolerate? So for my sins, I've been working on this North Korea problem for 20 years, and others here have longer. And every time I hear someone say we have to give North Korea one more chance to see if dialogue will work, it reminds me of bars where I used to live in Japan, and inside the door there was a sign saying, starting tomorrow, no drinking. So everyone felt very good about themselves while they drank. And at one point do we just decide or realize North Korea is just not serious about negotiating away its nuclear program? I think that's basically what you're asking, ma'am. So is it your view this is the last chance? I mean, how much more do we have to try this thing which has not worked for 20-some years?
You see, now the North Korea haven't totally realized the weaponization, nuclear weaponization. They are still, maybe in 2 or 3 years, they will totally go across the nuclear threshold, becoming a de facto nuclear states just like India, Pakistan, and Israel. At that time, there's no way to force them to go back. But before that, there's still a slip of chance. We can do something. If the international community can unite it, and we can have more coordination and cooperation. Just like in our daily life, some people make a decision. We have to do something, but it doesn't mean he must be successful. Yeah. The objective condition is very important. So if we can unite it, we can persuade them to change their wrong idea. We can force them to change their idea. So there is still a slip of chance. But if we can't resume talks in 2 or 3 years, I think the situation will be very pessimistic. And finally, maybe we just can only prepare for the worst case scenario, that is in the future, the military conflict and even a war. So that's very bad situation. But anyway, we still should have a try. That's my point.
I'm going to go to Zhu Feng next, and then to David and Bunny. On North Korea question or the other ones. So Zhu Feng, on North Korea or the others.
Okay, I'm a little bit more pessimistic, similar to Torsen. Torsen is very senior to me, but I'm a little bit pessimistic. I don't think Kim Jong-un would like to negotiate in exchange for any better off by dismissing their nuclear weapon, because they consider, in the minds of the Pyongyang, nuclear weapon is the only last resort to secure the regime's security or secure the regime's safety rather than national security. The second is nuclear bomb probably is the only way for Kim Jong-un to magnify how holy, how admirable he is to be a top leader of the DPRK. So then, by all means, negotiation, yes, we should leave this option there, but for me, unless 2 conditions happen, there's no way DPRK will abandon their nuclear weapons through negotiation. One, to my understanding, to be honest, one is U.S. is seriously signaling the military strike is coming over. And second condition is China is unbelievably clear in signaling the Pyongyang, we are going to abandon you. So then, yes, I consider negotiation is always operable. We say the policy tool, but the problem is under what conditions. History also is very telling in the past 3 decades. So then we needed to be more serious. Then second question is about, for example, it's about this mutually assured restraint. I consider most important thing we should have some sort of a bottom line mentality. If both sides have such a bottom line mentality and somehow very smartly and also very constructively accommodating each other, I think such a mutually assured restraint will be totally achievable.
Thanks. I don't know what I can possibly add to all of this, except to say that the visual of President Putin and President Xi Jinping calling for the dual suspension approach to Korea does not give me a lot of confidence that the gentleman's prospect or idea of China taking the lead in dealing with North Korea has any legs. So I think that's a non-starter and does not give me a lot of confidence. The second thing I would say is that if ever any country deserved an award for strategic patience, it should be China with North Korea. If you look at the last 70 years, were it not for North Korea and Kim Il-sung, China would probably have owned Taiwan in 1950. And if you don't believe me, you can ask Professor Warren Cohen, who's sitting here in the front row, an old friend. If it was not for North Korea and their Nodong and Taepodong missiles, Japan probably wouldn't have signed the revised guidelines for defense cooperation back in 1998, because I was in the Pentagon at that time involved in that. Had it not been for those missiles, North Korean missiles, you wouldn't have had Japan providing billions of dollars for the very ballistic missile defense that China sees as a threat to itself, and there would be no rationale for approximately 30,000 troops, U.S. American forces in China's neighborhood, which is definitely viewed by China as not a good thing. So how much is enough? We'll leave that to friends in China to deal with. The third thing I would point out is that dealing with North Korea is a trip to the land of bad policy options, but not just for the United States, also for China too. And I know that Chinese decision makers and policy makers and leaders must be struggling with the monumental implications of what they're being faced with at the moment because of North Korea. To wit, up until now, China has not had to choose between North Korea and South Korea. China has been able to have it both ways to a certain degree. Sooner or later, China is going to have to lean to one side on this issue, and how it leans to one side on this issue will say a lot about its aspirations for world leadership. So this is not just a tough decision for the U.S. These are tough policy decisions for leaders and friends in China as well. And I'm honest to God, glad that I don't have to make a decision on this, because there are no good options at the moment. And if you had the time, I could give you 15 minutes on why, as General Mattis, Secretary Mattis says, a conflict in Korea would be the most disastrous departure that we've had in this century.
Very short, since we are just about out of time. The question that this gentleman in the middle asked suggests somehow that what we, China, the United States, are willing to do will satisfy North Korea. Maybe a useful conversation between the U.S. and China is, what does North Korea really want? You say U.S. recognize North Korea. Is that really what North Korea wants? North Korea wants to be recognized as a nuclear weapons state, not simply diplomatic ties with the United States. I don't think China really wants to take over the North Korea problem, but I can certainly be confident North Korea doesn't want China to take over the problem. If China offered North Korea today a nuclear umbrella, the North Koreans would say, thanks, but no thanks, we have our own. So I think that maybe that would have worked before 2006, when the North Koreans tested their first nuclear weapon. But I think it's clear to me that what the North Koreans want is a nuclear weapons capability. They have it. They want to be able to deliver it to the continental United States. I think Zhang Tuosheng is far too optimistic in terms of his time frame. The U.S. and China and Russia are going to have to work out what we classify this recent test as. But I think from the U.S. point of view, if it were a standard trajectory, it would have traveled approximately, I think it was, 6,000 miles. That is ICBM range. So I think the North Koreans have already miniaturized a nuclear warhead. I think most people believe that. It may have mastered reentry capability without the warhead burning up. We are probably far closer to this goal. Not to a nuclear deterrent, which is really something else, but having a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. And I'm just going to end on one very specific point that goes back to the issue of North Korea using Chinese banks and why this is so important to address. Between 2009 and 2016, approximately $300 million was laundered through these banks in the U.S. financial system. This money is going to support the WMD programs in North Korea. And so this is a place to start. We can also cut down the North Korean laborers because a portion of their salary is going to North Korea's elite. And I think we should take a look at issues like crude oil. Why do we have to wait until North Korea does its 6th nuclear test to cut back on crude oil? This is an area where China has enormous leverage. So there's more that we can do. Overall trade is going to be on the Trump administration's agenda. China conducts, North Korea's 88% of North Korea's trade with the international community is with China. And I know that's a very, very sensitive issue with Beijing, but it will be discussed too. So I hope that our two countries can have a more serious discussion about what's really doable and not just talk about suspension for suspension or things that I frankly are not workable at this point, because we've really reached a very critical turning point, I think, with this ICBM test.
I want to thank the panel and all your fellow authors and working group members who are not on the stage. David thanked his co-writers. I did the Asia-Pacific paper with Mira Rapp-Hooper from CNAS and Richard Bush from Brookings, but with a lot of participation from Bonnie and Doug Paul and other experts around town. And this was a good discussion, and now for the really hard part. I'm going to invite the next panel to come up. State Roy is going to moderate, and we will give you room now. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. The first panel really did a stellar job of staying within the time limits and in staying within the guidelines of not simply summarizing their papers, but actually looking for areas of convergence and divergence between the views of the two sides, and particularly those with policy significance. Our panel will be dealing with a different set of issues, but ones that are actually also fundamentally important to the bilateral U.S.-China relationship. Economics. This was the area which during our election campaign seemed to be the most confrontational issue between China and the United States. And unlike the exciting North Korean issue, which gets a lot of the attention, the problem with the North Korean problem is nobody knows what to do. There don't seem to be any good options, but the administration thinks that it has options. for dealing with the trade imbalance with China, and how the United States handles attitudes on economic issues has a potentially major impact on the bilateral relationship. Global governance is another big issue. This has to do, is China really out to undo the liberal world order that the United States set up after World War II? Does it want to push us out of Asia? How are the governance issues playing, what role is it playing in the relationship between the United States and China? And politics is fundamentally important. Attitudes in both countries, public attitudes, often do not support the declared policies of the government. Polling shows that attitudes toward the United States and China are more hostile than attitudes in the United States toward China. But when you think about it, you realize, of course, because from China's standpoint, the United States is supporting countries who are making territorial claims against China, or we are supporting Taiwan in ways that China sees as interfering on a very important territorial issue to them. And we don't have any territorial issues with China in the same way that the Chinese see the issue. So it's not surprising that if one side has a territorial issue, that's going to affect public attitudes. So public attitudes are very important, and our panelists will get into the subject. I will encourage them to be equally diligent in sticking within the time limits, but please remember we have one additional member of our panel, so that the pressures on us will be even greater. We'll start off with, there was a Chinese participant who was supposed to be commenting on the economic side, one of the drafters of the Chinese paper. Unfortunately, he could not be present. So the economics issue is the one where the United States will be dominating the presentation, although I'm sure that if we say anything that the Chinese feel has to be rebutted, they will not be hesitant in doing so. Scott, why don't you lead off?
Thank you very much, Stape, and it's an honor to be a part of this project with everyone on both the first panel and this one, as well as all the other contributors. And I wanted to talk about the economic relationship. The paper that you have in the report that we published today was written jointly by myself and Liz Economy from the Council on Foreign Relations. We had several other people who acted as advisors, who helped guide us along, but we're jointly responsible for what you like in the paper, as well as, of course, all of the mistakes and challenges as well. I also want to commend He Fan from Peking University School of Business, who can't be here today because of a family illness, but he and his team, the other 3 authors on his team and the rest of their group, really should be commended for a very thoughtful analysis, a serious discussion, presentation of evidence in their paper as well, which is on the CSIS website, which you can read. Let me say a little bit about the sort of the differences, similarities and differences in our analysis on economic issues, and then similarities and differences where we come down in terms of policy prescriptions as well. And particularly since He Fan is not here, I want to try and be as balanced as possible, even though I probably can't fully meet that ideal, but I'm going to try. I do think in terms of our analysis, both sides agree that the U.S.-China commercial relationship has been largely mutually beneficial, that it has benefited both sides, that despite the fact that there is this large trade deficit bilaterally, that number shouldn't be the measure by which we judge whether the relationship is beneficial or not. I think also we agreed on both sides that the United States economy faces a variety of challenges, and not all of those challenges emanate from Beijing or from anywhere in China, but emanate domestically, and there are things the United States needs to do to address those that don't involve China. We also agree that China's economy is changing, evolving. The role of the government in governance in managing the economy is changing, and that China still is trying to integrate itself into the global economy. I think we all agreed to that, those sets of analysis. But we differed in a variety of other ways that are very important, I think. I think the U.S. paper, you'll find, if you look at it, we focus heavily on what we see is the growing centrality of Chinese industrial policy and protectionism in managing its economy, in making life more difficult for those that want to export to China and those that do business in China. And this is not a question of just whether how much it contributes to the U.S. trade deficit or not, or how much jobs it affects, but first the question of basic unfairness and the difference between this behavior and Chinese commitments, as well as the effect on companies that are competing with China in the U.S. and elsewhere. But even beyond that, because of China's size, its unique size, Chinese industrial policy is having a huge global effect on business models, not just in China, but globally. So it's really important that we address this issue, not because we're trying to support one company winning over another, but because of China's size, and it has a special responsibility. And that is something that we focused on. I think Hufan and his group on the Chinese side did focus primarily on the benefits that both sides gain from the relationship, the need to continue that, and to avoid any path which would lead to growing protectionism on either side. Our sense was, again, from our report, is that these Chinese declarations of continued reform and opening, although repeated consistently by Chinese leaders, officials, in the press, are inconsistent with the reality on the ground in China. In addition, we don't see a consistency or equivalency between the challenges that foreign companies face in the Chinese market and some of the things the United States has already done with regard to market access in the United States, or things that we're thinking of, for example, including revising CSIS. I don't think there's really much that the U.S. has on the table as a possibility that would come close to what are ongoing obstacles to access in the Chinese market. And I think you see this difference in approach, in analysis, in the current rhetorical fight between the United States and China, where China says it's opposed to protectionism, and the United States most recently at the G7 in Italy, and I expect we'll see this weekend at the G20 in Germany, its opposition to trade-distorting measures. I think that's a good summary of the different overall visions of what's going on. Now, when, as the ambassador alluded to, when we got underway, we expected that after President Trump came into office, that the U.S.-China economic relationship would be very contentious. Right away, based on everything that we saw in the campaign. And also there was concerns in the Obama administration, and I think there was growing consensus about a need for a sort of a more a tougher approach on China, as you could say. But that's not what we saw. That's what we've seen essentially in the first several months of the Obama administration. We described the American policy so far as sort of pursuing general cooperation and openness, and we expected the U.S. to move towards what we call conditional cooperation and openness, which is essentially much more like the idea of reciprocity that is now circulating around and that we hear about every day. So now there's a chance, we've seen over the last few weeks, that the U.S. may be shifting, that it may be moving away from this effort to seek cooperation and deliverables toward putting more pressure on China to try and get outcomes that address these questions of Chinese industrial policy, and considering penalties and pressure. So we can't be sure, because we're not exactly clear what American policy towards China is overall, or what our clear policy is on trade. But we will see, over this coming weekend, a discussion of the global forum and what's going on with Chinese subsidies with steel and aluminum. And I think we'll have a better sense next week of whether we're seeing just some media coverage on trying to push things in a new way, or whether this is really a substantial turn. In terms of policy recommendations in our report, and this is where I'll conclude, I think, again, we had actually a lot of common agreement about the commercial relationship in terms of policy. I think we agreed that the U.S. should not engage in wholesale protectionism and just using any convenient tool sitting around above board or below board to just whack, to use Ju Feng's term, to punch the United States, for example. We, again, agreed that the U.S. needs to do a lot to improve its domestic economy that isn't related and dependent on China. I think we also agreed in both reports that China needs to continue to reform and open up. In the U.S. report, we say China needs to resume that. The Chinese say continue. But nevertheless, the direction, I think, is the same on both sides. Where we differed, as I think, again, the U.S. believes in our report that China isn't living up to its commitments and that much more needs to be done to bring China back into compliance and restart liberalization. And there are a variety of things that the U.S. can do bilaterally, multilaterally, both carrots and sticks, and be proactive in pushing for that outcome. So we, to begin with, is simply just rigorously enforcing U.S. trade laws bilaterally and in the WTO. We're not advocating discouraging Chinese investment in the United States because it strengthens the economy. But we do think that it's reasonable to strengthen the process for considering whether individual investments, particularly in high tech, may have concerns for national security. Within our group, there was no consensus about the principle or this term reciprocity. But we do think U.S. investment policy should be somewhat affected by how China treats American investment. Finally, the U.S. side thinks that the U.S.-China bilateral dialogue is extremely important, but solving all the problems in this economic relationship isn't just about the bilateral track. The U.S. and China need to engage in multilateral fora, in regional fora, and the U.S. needs to further engage its allies. You can't pick a fight with everyone at the same time on every issue if addressing this type of core strategic challenge is a real important goal. So the United States needs to pick its priorities, pick those it's going to cooperate with so it can engage China more effectively on these issues and achieve what we hope would be a more genuine win-win outcome. Thank you.
We will now move on to global governance, and Professor Gewirtz will lead off.
Thank you, Ambassador Roy. It's been a privilege, as others have said, to participate in this project. And I think it's important to say that because this project demonstrates how much goodwill there is in each country to work hard to try to get this complex U.S.-China relationship on the best possible path. It's been good to participate in that and to continue to participate in that. The topic of global governance is one that has been particularly disoriented, I think is the word, by Donald Trump's election as U.S. president. And I will get to that in a few minutes, but I want to begin with the reports, because the reports, I think, reflect and demonstrate a rather surprising amount of agreement on this large topic of global governance. And I want to just give 6 quick examples, also noting along the way some of the disagreements. But in the current climate, I think it's important to emphasize those agreements. We agree that global challenges, of which there are many, require global solutions, and that no single country is going to be able to address them effectively in isolation, that cooperation is the path that produces the most shared benefits, and that rules-based approaches are usually better than ad hoc responses. Second area of agreement, the main institutions of global governance established after World War II remain essential institutions in the system of global governance. The Chinese paper probably puts more emphasis on the United Nations and criticizes the U.S. for sometimes departing from UN processes and norms. But the truth is the U.S. remains strongly committed to the United Nations, and truthfully, no country has a perfect record regarding the United Nations. Third, we agree that the established institutions of global governance need some reforms, taking account of new power relations, taking account of new realities. Yes, there are differences on what those reforms might be, but there is a shared agreement that we should be talking about what those reforms are. Fourth, we want each other, both the U.S. and China wants each other to be active players in global governance. There is some difference in the nuance that the United States has wanted China to be a full stakeholder, and China, by calling itself a developing country, has sometimes seemed to the U.S. to want it both ways. But recently, by both ways I mean being a partial stakeholder, but I don't think that's really a concern much anymore. It is very clear that China has been stepping up and has changed both its self-understanding and its ambitions in playing a full-throated global role. Indeed, that may be creating some problems for the United States that are more substantial than China being a partial stakeholder. Fifth, we agree that the established institutions of global governments can be, and already are, in good ways, being supplemented by various multinational mechanisms of governance. Now, not surprisingly, this is an area where I think a number of more substantial differences have surfaced in the two reports and in the discussions around those reports. The Chinese, has already been noted, criticize the alliance system. And the U.S. considers that the alliance system, especially in Asia, or at least certainly in Asia, has contributed to the stability of the whole region, which has allowed China itself to prosper. And we, I think, recognize in the U.S. that alliances come in a rather broad spectrum of different kinds of partnership and commitment. Another difference, the U.S. applauds China's ambitions to make greater contributions to global development, but has also expressed some concerns about whether these Chinese-led institutions will develop norms of adequate transparency and governance. And those concerns, among others, led the U.S. To decline to join AAIB. But I think, as we indicate in the U.S. report, that there's been a changed set of views on the U.S. side, and the report recommends that the U.S. consider ways of cooperating in AAIB, and as you probably mostly know, a high-level U.S. government representative was recently sent to the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. The most complicated and difficult difference that has emerged, I think, in this area concerns the phrase liberal international order and what that implies. That phrase, which is certainly widely used in the West to characterize the institutions after World War II and after the fall of the Soviet Union, has elements of emphasizing markets, individual freedoms, rule of law, democracy. And China, and in its paper so indicates that that's a Western ideological mindset, and it has been invoking, and this paper invokes, a different concept in the paper called inclusiveness, and elsewhere I've seen the phrase diversity, in which global governance institutions are not guided by a liberal mindset, but welcome as equals illiberal political systems and are not about the business of changing those liberal institutions, or those illiberal institutions. It's obviously a very hard, complicated topic that we don't have time to discuss, but it's clearly an emerging one of great significance. The papers lastly agree on the areas where global governance is really needed, and you know those, and that's part why there is agreement. Economic architecture that addresses current realities and problems in globalization, addressing issues of cyberspace, terrorism, and serious problems of climate change. And that last example is the pivot to my sort of closing observations, which climate change, as an example, crystallizes the point I began with, which is that a central problem in the moment currently in the field of global governance is that our American president has already taken a sharp turn away from the decades-long path of American leadership in the global order. His slogan is America First. He's begun a process of withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. He scrapped TPP. He's criticized NATO, and he's given no sign yet of nurturing and focusing on the strengthening and building of institutions of global governments. So it's fair to already start wondering what is the fate of this project in the upcoming period. And I want to close by simply mentioning reasons why I think this current moment is not one that should prevent the efforts of people like us to be developing and working hard on thinking through these ideas. And let me just mention quickly 3 factors. One, it's early in the Trump administration. We don't really know where this administration is going to go on these issues. Secondly, the United States of America is not just the period after Donald Trump's election until the next election. We will have a long future, and the issue of global governance is not a made-up issue. It's a response to realities that require international cooperation, and the United States will have a future after Donald Trump, which I believe will focus more, again, on issues of global governance. And lastly, in the present, right now, the United States of America is not just the national government. And there are enormous numbers of actors who are working, in spite of what the national government may be doing, to sustain and develop and be active in issues of global governance. And I'll mention 3. States. Under the American system, yes, states can't sign international treaties, but they have sovereign powers, and they are standing up, particularly after the announced withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. Take Jerry Brown, governor of California, 40 million people. He has organized other governors to take collective action to try to jointly meet the Paris climate guidelines. He met with Xi Jinping in Beijing. Xinhua News Service had a headline that said, President Xi eyes bigger role for California in U.S.-China relations. Interesting. And he invited California to join the Belt and Road Initiative. So states, don't forget about them. 2, companies, businesses are active in the enterprise of global guidelines, global judgments. And lastly, NGOs, which play a distinctively strong role in the United States in galvanizing public opinion, helping on implementation of rules, and sometimes even sitting at the table at global governance institutions. So there's work to be done in the present, regardless of what the national government is doing, and I consider this project, even in the small working group on global governance, to be part of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Dr. Lee?
Thanks, Chair and Paul. Good presentation. And I also working on the global governance part of the China side report. I'd like to say that both sides report is very positive and constructive.
Please be sure you're close enough to the microphone so that everybody can hear you.
Okay. And China and the U.S. all believes that during the past years, both countries have made great contribution to the global governance issues, such as the protection of the environment and the cooperation of global economy and the non-proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction, etc. And that's why in U.S. report, it welcomes China to play more active role in the future, and China also attach great importance to the bilateral cooperation on this area. The U.S. and China also reached comments on what's the future challenges facing by both sides. That is, we all called it a kind of an uncertainty about the continuation of such a good cooperation. Both sides provide the observations and conclusions. Some conclusions are similar, such as we're all concerned about that Trump's policy focus transfer from the global to the domestic. Domestic will bring some negative effect on the future cooperation. And some conclusions are very different. For example, what impressed me most is that in the U.S. report, when they're talking about the future China maybe bring some kind of uncertainty to the global governance cooperation, is that they think China want to change the current system just because they think the current system is developed is created by the developed countries and particularly led by the U.S. Actually, it's not true. That's why in the China's report, our team provides the basic attitude of China's side to how to understand the whole system reform. I think we have two key points in this area. The first thing is China always think the reform when it's necessary. Indeed, in the practical level, we all know that there are some specific mechanisms have some problems that made them cannot cope with new emerging challenges. So that's why sometimes we need to take some reform measures to improve its efficiency. And the other key point is that reform should be based on the consensus. That means no one country, no one stakeholder can do all the reform thing on its own. So it needs cooperate and needs the worldwide consensus. So I think maybe there are some differences between the China and the U.S. And on the basis of the analysis of the future challenges, both sides also keep focus on how to gap the differences and how to enhance our cooperation on the global governance issues. Both sides provide some specific suggestions or advices. I'd like to conclude them with 4 keywords, 2 from the U.S. side and 2 from the China side. I think the most valuable keyword from the U.S. side, one is the mutual trust. That means both sides should judge one another's global governance initiative based on its targets, objectives, but not simply on its ideological mindset. And the second one from the U.S. side is that consensus. It means whatever happens in the governance system reform, we should cooperate and consult worldwide and make some consensus. Just focus on the same consensus, we can make some reform measures. And I think the two valuable words from China's side, one is the practical. That means we should need more practical common actions to do some things. Not just stay on the stage of keep arguing or keep planning. We all know the process of governance, global governance, actually is a kind of process or practice, which have been proved is the most efficient way to enhance communication and improve the cooperation. And the final keyword from the China side, I think it should be the focus. That means that, as we all know, not only for China, but also for the US states, the resources, the governance resources are always limited. And there are so many different global governance areas. We should allocate these resources effectively in different governance issues and keep the balance between the global governance and domestic governance at the same time. So we should do something really efficient on this area. I'd like to end up with another, how to say, maybe a little bit pity from the US side. You know, when we're talking about this area of issues, our team really look forward to figure out how the US colleagues think what kind of specific or practical actions or the projects on the different global governance issues. That's why we spend a lot of time to discuss this kind of questions. But comparing with the China's side, I think the US colleagues make a very general conclusion on these specific areas. So I really look forward to hear about a lot of more specific details, about detailed information about the different governance issues this area. I'd like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move on to politics. Evan, would you like to lead off?
Thank you, Ambassador Roy. I'd like to begin by thanking CSIS and my Chinese colleagues. When we embarked originally on this project, we weren't sure exactly how it was going to go. I've worked on collaborative projects between American and Chinese scholars many times before, and it's a challenge for the obvious reasons. And as a result, they gave me the hardest topic of them all, politics. And it was the hardest because it's so sensitive. It's, of course, sensitive in America, but it's even more sensitive in China. But yet, the two teams worked together, persevered, and I think we're able to generate very credible products. So what I'd like to do is make 3 points about how I think politics impacts the U.S.-China relationship and weave into those comments some thoughts about the differences where views converge and diverge, and hopefully make it policy relevant. My first point is that when one looks at the U.S.-China relationship, and I look at it from a very practical perspective, I was very fortunate enough to serve in the Obama administration at the White House for 6 years, and I had 6 years where I got to sit at the control panel of the U.S.-China relationship and see all the lights flash and the buttons whirl and figure out how this big relationship operates, and it was fascinating. And one of the lessons that I took away from that, and there are many lessons and I'm still digesting them years later, is that this is a deeply mature relationship. And what I mean is, as of 2017, this is a 38-year-old relationship, right? This is not a young kid. This is not an adolescent. It's not even a 20-year-old. 38-year-old relationship, which means America knows China and China knows America. Now, that doesn't mean we still don't have a lot to learn from one another. We're constantly changing and evolving as societies, as countries, as polities. But nonetheless, there is a big and rich data set that both sides can draw from in understanding the sort of the pace, the scope, the tenor of the U.S.-China relationship. And I think that the scope, the depth, and the quality of the papers in this particular project reflect that underlying maturity in the U.S.-China relationship. I mean, look no further than the current period of the U.S.-China relationship. The U.S. took arguably 4 major actions against China last week: Taiwan, North Korea, South China Sea, you know, in all the sensitive areas. Did the bottom fall out of the relationship? No. Is the relationship in a rapid spiral downward? No, not really. Both presidents talked a few days afterwards. They're going to meet on Saturday. So in other words, you know, there are boundaries around this relationship that are shaped by politics. But nonetheless, I think it's important to keep in mind the maturity of the relationship. That was point number 1. Point number 2, as we try and understand what these boundaries are and how we get things done, and in the case of the work that myself and Mr. Diao and Fanji Shi and others did on politics, as we're trying to understand how politics in both countries affects the U.S.-China relationship, I think there's one distinction that's critical to understanding how to assess this relationship. And it's a distinction that I have used before, some of you have heard me refer to, which is distinguishing between the structural features of the relationship. In other words, those features of the relationship that are enduring and probably aren't going to change and will have a deep and profound effect on the ability to stabilize the relationship and to shape it. So a distinction between the structural features of the relationship and the cyclical features. In other words, sort of the issues that come up on a day-to-day basis. And we've talked about a lot of them today: North Korea, Taiwan, South China Sea. And certainly in the think tank community in Washington, it's fun and exciting and engaging to talk about those cyclical issues, but sometimes they don't really have a long-term effect on the trajectory of the relationship. And in particular, what does the shape of that curve look like? And so I think this is an important distinction, because when one thinks about these issues of politics in the U.S.-China relationship, that is deep structure. That's something that probably isn't going to change anytime soon. And it's important that we not always get caught up in the day-to-day debates about China, North Korea, South China Sea, Tibet, Taiwan, etc., and yet focus on these structural features. And there's 2 structural features that I think came out of our analysis of how politics impacts the relationships. And the first is that it's clear that competition and the competitive aspects of the U.S.-China relationship are coming to the fore. And that's not meant to be a dark or negative statement, but rather a statement about sort of the balance of issues facing the U.S.-China relationship. And Dave Finkelstein sort of began to go down this pathway in his description of the U.S.-China military-to-military relationship. But these are not issues. This is not a statement about issues that we should shy away from. We need to embrace the competitive aspects of the relationship, because that's the only way we're going to manage them. And in fact, one of Xi Jinping's attributes is the fact that he has been relatively frank and open about the fact that there are disagreements. We have to talk about them. They're going to generate competition. The question is not, can we avoid competition? The question is, what kind of competition is it? Is it competition that leads us both to improve our game and raise our capabilities, or is it destructive competition, militarized competition that runs the risk of instability and militarized conflict? So competition is one structural aspect. The second is sort of what I refer to as resilience and stability in the relationship. Because from my perspective, there's a big difference. And while I find that the U.S.-China relationship is not always the most stable relationship, there's lots of disagreements, we disagree regularly, but it's a relationship that is actually quite resilient. In other words, even though there's disagreement, even though there's competition, there's a sort of core of stability at the center of it that has bounded these disagreements and this competition from leading to a free fall. Now that's something that could change, but it's something that I noticed evolve over the Obama administration, and it's one of these cyclical features that could become structural depending on how the politics play out. So what does that mean for my assessment of the papers? Well, I would say that these papers are excellent complement. They actually do two very different things. They highlight different aspects of the relationship. The Chinese paper was very focused on history, ideology, and the way in which those issues affect Chinese perceptions of the U.S.-China relationship. I think the paper is a very good description of how China believes that ideology, and in particular this feeling that China has been the victim, China has been wronged by the United States, and how that affects Chinese perceptions of the U.S. and the U.S.-China relationship. And it's clear from the paper that China really holds on to these, and that even in 2017, that these issues affect Chinese perceptions of U.S. strategic intentions and the quality of cooperation that can be gained in the U.S.-China relationship. I have to admit, I was surprised by the fact that there was so much discussion in the paper about the U.S. trying to change China's political system, and that continues to be a core fear at the heart of the U.S.-China relationship. And I say that because as somebody that spent 6 years in the White House, I was not in a single conversation with the President, the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, where anybody said China's political system is a threat to American national security and we have to do everything possible to change it. Never once, never even remotely close. Now that said, of course, we have questions and concerns about human rights in China, the clampdown on political freedoms, because that's who we are, and that is a structural feature of the U.S.-China relationship. But that is very, very different than the kind of claims addressed in the paper. The U.S. paper took a different approach. When Mike and I were working on it, we focused less on history and ideology and more on institutions, actors, and changing American perceptions, and how the changing set of institutions, the fact that the executive branch appears to be playing a much more consistently active role in both formulating and implementing China policy, the fact that there's a broader set of actors in the United States influencing the U.S.-China relationship. We talked about the business community, we talked about NGOs, and Paul's great presentation reminded me of the importance of subnational actors, states in the United States, Governor Brown, for example, and the important role they can play in bounding competition, expanding cooperation. Now that raises the question, does that mean ideology and history doesn't play a role in American perceptions of China? And I would say no. I would just say that in the U.S. we don't really call it ideology. What we call it is international relations theory. And what I mean by that is that there are different schools of thought in the United States about China's strategic intentions. You have and I'll use two sort of stylized schools of thought to make my point. The spectrum is obviously far more diverse. On the one hand, you have the sort of offensive realists, John Mearsheimer, Ashley Tellis. China wants to recreate the Sinocentric tributary system and will do everything possible to become the hegemon in East Asia. On the other hand, you have a group of China specialists. I would maybe point to somebody like Michael Swain's work, excellent work, who tries to point out that China has a much more nuanced approach to the region. It's not trying to recreate a Sino-centric system, but rather it's trying to find greater space for its rise in East Asia as it tries to protect its self-defined economic and security interests. But my point is, in the United States, we have our own competing schools of thought, and those have different influence on U.S. Policy over time. So the Chinese paper would benefit from a greater attention to actors, institutions, processes, and how those affect perceptions. And I think the U.S. paper would have benefited from a little bit more discussion of sort of the range of schools of thought in the United States, because we have our own manifestation of ideological and theoretical lenses that inform our approach. Let me end with this point, which is, what does this all mean for the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship? And I'm very much of the view that the evolution of the U.S.-China relationship is one that is going to be determined by a series of ad hoc decisions by both sides. To put it differently, the future of the U.S.-China relationship is a constant search for a stable strategic modus vivendi between Washington and Beijing. But unfortunately, the search for that stable strategic modus vivendi is not going to occur at a Potsdam or a Yalta-type negotiation. I think many people in this room wish it were, that you could just have two leaders sit down, hash it out, and move on. But rather, it's going to be a series of ad hoc decisions. And the question is, will the political institutions in both countries, institutions, actors, perceptions, filtered through ideology and history, allow that sort of series of actions to be one that takes the U.S. and China down a pathway toward a gradual convergence of interests, where there's both cooperation and competition, or one where the pathway looks darker? Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. And now, Mr. Jiao Daming.
Thank you, Ambassador. It is hard, even dangerous for sleepy people to talk about politics, but I will try my best. I'm honored to participate in the writing of the Chinese report and to attend the so great panel here today. Actually, my research is focusing on U.S. politics, so the process of writing for me is a very good chance to reconsider about Chinese politics, about the U.S.-China relations. I want to say that I have read the U.S. report very carefully, and especially the wonderful analysis about the U.S. congressional role in the U.S.-China foreign policy making. I totally agree with the idea of ups and downs of congressional power. Compared with the two reports, we have a lot of consensus. We all agree that domestic politics is one of the most factors shaping U.S.-China relations. Most importantly, we all believe that when the two countries' political goals are consistent, the bilateral relations will make a significant progress. I think that is a very important consensus. Of course, we have some difference. I think, personally, I think the most, maybe the biggest difference between the two reports is that the two sides seems think about the world politics in different ways. For the Chinese report, we talk about politics as a very big issue, such as political system, ideology, or even the political stability. But the U.S. report give me some impression that the politics is about the governmental process, the decision-making process, especially the key players during this process. I think just because of this difference, the Chinese report gave us a bigger political background and the future of U.S.-China relations. And the U.S. report talk about, have more discussion about the key details, such as Congress, such as business community, NGO, even the personal factor of the leadership. Personally, I think for a lot of issues, if you talk about, if you focus more on the details, it's very easy for people to find out some problem, even some negative problem. But when you pay more attention on the overall historical trend, maybe we may see a better future. So why there's some difference? The reason for the difference maybe is the deficit of the mutual trust. Is that China and the United States still have doubts on how to look at each other, how to deal with each other. Of course, to some distance, China is still worried about some so-called political involvement of the United States, and for the U.S. part, maybe because the diversity of the decision-making participants, so there are more and more different, even conflicting views on China or on Chinese politics. Though for a long time, as Ivan mentioned, there's a long history of U.S.-China relations, so we have a long time to try to resolve the difference gradually. But as both of us, both of this report mentioned that the sub-national level relation, I think that is the best choice now for us. That is one of the, it's the best choice for us to strengthen the U.S. The sub-national relation between U.S. and China, such as the state to province, the city to city, the county to county, or the local level. The sub-national relation exchange can not only bypass the so-called high politics disputes, and maybe can improve a lot of people-to-people exchange, such as economy, trade, technology, science, education, and so on, and will maybe it will consolidate the basis of the bilateral relations. In addition, I think that as the Chinese report mentioned, that there is a situation that the U.S. and China are confronting some kind of the same challenge, the same problems, but the solution may be not the same. As we know, China is continuing the economy reform, the open up reform, and try to improve the people's the welfare. And as we know, the Trump administration proposed the American First slogan and concern more about the economy, the jobs, the immigration, and other domestic issues. So maybe there's some more room for some kind of mutual learning, mutual cooperation, of a mutual benefit between our two countries. For the new development of the political factors since Trump took place, I think on the Chinese side, there's no big change. On the U.S. side, maybe there's some new points should be talked about. One of them is that the inner circle, the infighting inner circle politics of Trump's White House brings more uncertainty to U.S. foreign policy making. Outside the world totally have no idea about who and who at what time have how much influence on which issue. So it's a big uncertainty for even for United States. Another point I want to raise is that in case of Trump's unclear policy, U.S. Congress seems to once more dominate some foreign policies, for example, the Taiwan policy. So we can see the arms sales. We can see there is a bill named, titled Taiwan Travel Act, sponsored by Marco Rubio in the Senate and Stephen Chabot in the House. I don't think this trend is conducive to the stable development of U.S.-China relations. My time's up. I'll stop here. Thank you.
We've run over our time. The panelists have raised some fascinating issues that we could usefully explore for the next hour or two. But rather than eating into the time of Professor Wang Jisi, who is going to make concluding remarks, I will thank our panelists. And if you have questions, maybe you can call her members of the panel after the conclusion of our conference this afternoon.
I want to thank the panel and especially Ambassador Stape Roy, who chaired. Stape is part of the steering group on the U.S. side of senior China hands and veterans of foreign and defense policy who provided overall guidance and worked with John Hamre to produce an overview paper. The Chinese side also had a steering group with very distinguished scholars, diplomats, defense experts, and also produced an overview paper. And the principal author was our closing speaker, Professor Wang Jisi of Beida. So it's now over to you to sum up and tell us what we do next. Where do we go from here? Professor Wang.
I'm not going to summarize, and I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I will have to say something. First of all, on behalf of Ambassador Fu Ying and all the members on the Chinese research group, we want to express our heartfelt congratulations on the release of your very comprehensive report. That is the U.S. side, the report on the U.S. side. And we also want to express our sincerest appreciation to CSIS for its collaboration with us and his support to our joint effort. So actually we have two sets of reports, parallel reports. The beginning of this joint effort was the spring of 2016. Under the able stewardship of Ambassador Fu Ying, we initiated the research work on the future of U.S.-China relations. The initiative has been endorsed and financed by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences global think tank. That's all what I don't remember the exact name of that. It is called something like a Global Strategic Studies think tank. And we have been in touch with Chinese Foreign Ministry and other government agencies, senior diplomats, U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and various U.S. counterparts, individuals and institutions, especially CSIS. We are very much indebted to their advice and support. The research team on the Chinese side was composed of about 20 to 30 researchers, scholars, and policy analysts from numerous leading think tanks in China, actually not simply from Beijing, but from Shanghai, Nanjing, and elsewhere. They include the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, China Foundation for International and Strategic Studies, the National Defense University, the PLA Academy of Military Science, of course, my university, Peking University, and People's University, Fudan University, Shanghai Institute, Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, Nanjing University, Pango think tank, and many others. We held dozens of closed-door debates and discussions. Some were plenums, some were small group meetings, and we also held many meetings with our American counterparts in Beijing, Washington, D.C., or New York City. The end result is the Chinese report publicized in both Chinese and English, and we also want to thank CSIS for publicizing the Chinese report. And the Chinese report in both English and Chinese are already edited in the volume, which will be published by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Publishing House. I hope that it will come out pretty soon. And in May this year, we launched a rollout event in Beijing, similar to the one we are holding today in Washington, D.C. We have people from CSIS and other think tanks from the United States. This is simply my story, the Chinese side of the story. Equally important, or even more important, is that after a few rounds of consultations, CSIS made the decision to help us and to coordinate American think tanks to write a joint report, Instead, the first idea is to write something called a joint report, like the publicity of a teamwork collaborated by both sides. But because of the lack of communication, I mean, the means we are separated so widely, and we cannot reach consensus on every single issue. So we decided to do something like the Shanghai communique. That is, we express our views and they express their views. And you can compare notes. We compare notes first in the first place. So the end result is two separate and parallel reports reflecting our views of several dimensions like trade and economics, Asia-Pacific, global governance, the impact of domestic politics on the bilateral relationship, and military-to-military relations, and also, of course, an overview. And we have frequent exchanges of views between the United States and Chinese teams when we have two plenums in Washington, D.C., and another in Beijing, respectively. We compared notes, and we improved the quality of the papers. Substantively, we debated on the Chinese side more than we publicized them. I mean, honestly, we have different views among the Chinese on some issues, We don't have identical views on issues like North Korea or sensitive issues in Chinese foreign policy. Of course, generally we have a consensus, but on specific issues we don't have everything. In such a group, such a large group of 20 to 30 people, we cannot agree on everything. But what is available is generally the consensus on the Chinese side. But the consensus is not necessarily the government point of view, and this is our think tank's joint effort. We consulted the government, but we did not seek endorsement from government agencies. In our cooperation, I'm talking about the strategic-oriented think tank cooperation. Two things are striking to me. I'm speaking on myself in this regard. First, the frequent, substantive, and sustained dialogue is very useful. And as when we constructed the report, I cannot help but thinking about some earlier episode of the U.S.-China relationship. In the early 1990s, the economic and cultural exchanges were influenced by the political storm in Beijing. And then in the mid-1990s, our bilateral dialogue was suspended by Li Denghui's visit to the United States. And then in the late 1990s, there was the embassy bombing incident. And so the academic and the scholarly exchanges between universities and think tanks of the two countries was very often interrupted by political events. But nowadays, especially since the beginning of this century, we have very intensified and extensive changes of views between think tanks. And I think, personally speaking, I think that the intensity and extensiveness of the sustained dialogue between the two sides exceeds what I know as the exchanges of views between China and other countries. We have very strong ties with countries like Russia and Europe and many other countries. But I don't think our extensive dialogues are less frequent than our exchanges of views with the countries we have friendly relationship with, like Russia. And to be very honest, if I compare this relationship with our relationships with South Korea or Japan, in recent years, unfortunately, sometimes the exchanges of views have been interrupted by unhappy events or happenings. So what does this tell us? This tells us we have reached a new level of maturity. And in the words of Evan Medeiros, this reflects the resilience of the relationship. The second striking thing to me is, of course, how much we are familiar with each other's views and how much we know each other personally and individually. That includes some younger generation scholars and think tank people. In fact, because of the deepening understanding of U.S. think tank like CSIS, a great number of Chinese think tanks have been established in China in recent years. When we have specific issues to discuss or to debate, we know who we are going to talk to seek advice from. And And I would like to mention a paper I did with my friend Ken Lieberthal 5 years ago. And we co-authored a report on China-US strategic distrust. And this distrust was reflected in Evan Maduro's discussion of whether the United States wants to change China's political system. That is what we see as a very deepened distrust. In the past 5 years since we published that report, has the distrust been dispelled or reduced? My answer is no. I think the strategic distrust has deepened and become more extensive. But at the same time, have the two countries move closer to confrontation? Again, my answer is no. But why is that? Why it is a context between the two things? I can give some reasons that are reflected in our joint report, our parallel reports. First, we increased mutual understanding. We shared our more balanced, more sophisticated views on, the think tank views with with our separate, respective domestic audiences. And we are much less influenced by, for instance, conspiracy theories, because the conspiracy we can think about among the audience here, if they don't have conspiracy, I don't know where we can have those conspiracies. And you know us very well, and you know Chinese people and Chinese government officials much better than before. So it is very difficult to believe in those conspiracy theories. I'm not saying that there's no conspiracy, but conspiracies are not widespread, so widely spread. And second, we have more institutional linkages which are cushioning against possible conflict between the two sides. We are helping government agencies to construct crisis prevention and crisis management skills and devices. And this is what Zhang Chuosheng is very good at. And also, my friend Finkelstein also has talked about that. And third, despite the continuing mutual distrust, the two countries greatly enhanced their practical bilateral cooperation and multilateral cooperation, reflected in the report on global governance and reflected on the papers on economic and trade relations. And what is not talked too much about is the booming tourism between the two countries. And the United States is more interested in One Belt, One Road initiative, and China's best students continue to come to the United States for advanced studies. I'm not extremely happy about that because I'm losing some of my best students who I want them to attend our graduate schools, but instead they go to the best universities in the United States. But at the same time, we have many very good students from the United States studying in China. So this gives me somewhat more reason to be cautiously optimistic. I don't want to neglect the differences and the pitfalls, difficulties ahead. What I see is a new normal of the bilateral relationship, featured by increased cooperation and increased competition. And I don't know competition is greater or cooperation is greater. They are rising simultaneously. And another feature I see in the bilateral relationship is the increased degree of influence from domestic politics on both sides. And what should we do next? I don't have any good advice, but I'm thinking about more substantive and more collaborative projects. For instance, we can be somewhat more specific in discussing U.S.-China relations. One aspect is, for instance, investment, trade, and we can talk also about more extensively security, multilateral security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region. There are already proposals in that regard, so we can launch some joint programs on a great number of projects. And we should also try to bring countries like Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, India, and Russia into our collaboration. And we can even think of our joint effort to analyze situations in the Middle East. This morning I read very carefully a publication by your Vice President John Otterman on China and the United States in the Middle East. That is something we can also think about. So in any sense, the joint effort we have made so far has set up a good foundation for think tank cooperation in the future. We'll continue to rely on CSIS as our partner. Of course, we are also trying very hard to reach out to other U.S. think tanks. And on our side, we also want to reach out to other universities in China to bring them together to cooperate with you. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the American participants, I want to thank Professor Wang and, again, Ambassador Fu Ying, who brought this idea to us a little over a year ago. Everyone was interested, probably a dozen think tanks and universities at least heard her idea. And we weren't sure how it would work. It was an experiment, and I think it worked quite well for three reasons. One, the goodwill and the candor of all the participants. Number two, we structured it in a way where each side had to really think hard about how they thought about the other's relationship. But most importantly, third, because of Maria Sinclair and Sun Ying, an example of an American university graduate going to work for you, Professor Wang. So the two of them really herded all these cats, and we owe them special thanks. And thank you all for joining us.